Good morning and welcome to this web meeting on mobilizing climate investment at a time of global uncertainty with Mafalda Duarte, CEO of Climate Investment Funds. My name is Fabrizio Botti. I'm going to be the moderator of the event that is organized by the Istituto of Tali Internazionale in the framework of its partnership with Intesa San Paolo. The event aims at discussing how public, private, and multilateral actors could better cooperate to boost climate finance, but also the role of Italy in supporting climate action in developing and emerging economies at a time, as we all know, of unprecedented and concurrent global challenges. We are honored to host Mafalda Duarte here at TI office for some keynote remarks and participation to a panel with 4 Italian key public and private actors in the field. Antonella Baldino, Chief International Development Finance Officer at Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. Gisella Berardi, Deputy Director for Global Public Goods Office at the Italian Ministry of the Economy and Finance. Federica Calvetti in remote, Chief of ESG and Strategic Activism at Eurizon, and still in remote, Maurizio Maugeri, Head of International Business Development, GTRNM at ENI. We will also have a final question and answer session where additional questions and comments will be raised through the Zoom platform chat box. You can use it even during the webinar, or you're not used to it anymore. We can raise our physical hands here, here in the conference room, and I will try to involve all of you. Let me introduce Mafalda Duarte, first of all. She's CEO at the Climate Investment Funds, one of the world's largest multilateral funds for climate action in developing countries. Since her appointment in 2014, Mafalda Duarte has oversees hundreds of investment across 72 low and middle income countries. Under leadership at CIF, the mandate has expanded to include different areas like coal phase out, just transition, just to say something. There's someone, and prior to CIF, Mafalda also held senior position at the African Development Bank and the World Bank. Thank you very much, Mafalda, for being here. The floor is yours.
My Italian attempt. Buongiorno a tutti. Grazie mille. I love this expression. Grazie mille per l'invito. It's a real pleasure to be here. I will have a final sentence in Italian, but now I really must continue in English. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Rome on an official visit. I had been to Italy before on tourism, but not for work related matters. And it's a real pleasure to be able to not just meet with the government, Giselle and other colleagues in the Ministry of Finance, Economy and Finance, but also being here with all of you and being able to engage with private sector actors, also with think tanks. And I also was on a lecture yesterday at one of your universities. So the engagement with students as well is something that I treasure very much. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'll just make a few points. And then I think the really interesting part will come in the panel and during the conversation. And I'm not going to say anything new. I think we all know that we are going through quite extraordinary, challenging times. because we are not yet done with the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic, which have been, from a development point of view, quite significant. We know about the impacts in high-income countries, but the impacts in developing countries or middle-income countries and low-income countries has been quite severe. We have observed, because of the pandemic, the first reversal in many years in terms of combating poverty. We have seen more than 150 million people globally go back into poverty. And just another data point, a reversal in gains that we had achieved over the years on energy access, for example. In Africa, 13 million people went back. And so these are, of course, in addition to the numbers are quite considerable, 6 million people that have passed away because of the pandemic, and how many jobs have been lost globally, 225 million jobs. And the fact is that from a development point of view, we have seen considerable progress over the years on a lot of the human development indicators, on poverty reduction as well. But we've also seen concerns in terms of inequality. COVID, again, and the pandemic has widened inequality, which is another concern, and has widened inequality in particular for women and young people, and also the low skilled and the informal workers. And now we layer this on top of the pandemic. We layer the war in Ukraine, which is, again, is not something that is contained in Europe. Europe is, let's say, the first impacted, but the impact doesn't restrain to Europe. These are global impacts again. And we are seeing the macroeconomic context. We are seeing the increase in energy prices. We are seeing the increase in food prices. So these inflationary pressures are of concern, of course, in Europe, in North America, but they are very concerning for the developing countries. And we will see what the response is from the Fed and the central banks. But we know there's already been an increase in interest rates. And there are expectations that potentially more, we don't know how many more, but this creates another problem, which is the servicing of the debt. And this comes on the back of the middle-income countries and the low-income countries already being in a very difficult fiscal situation and with very high levels of debt coming out of the pandemic. So the global, this is why I said we are facing quite extraordinary, unprecedented, challenging times, and we have climate change, which hasn't said, okay, now we have COVID and we have a war in Ukraine. Let's wait. It doesn't work like that, as we know. So we are seeing the consequences already of climate impacts being disproportionately, again, impacting middle and low income countries. And the risk here is that these other shocks that are happening derail climate action. And in particular, the impact that, and derail investments in middle and low income countries in terms of in derailing investments that are aligned with climate objectives. So I think this is really the key issue that we are faced with, key issues that we are faced with today. how to combine both the response to the immediate shocks while not really derailing or stop putting an emphasis on climate investments, both in Europe and North America, and in the middle and low-income countries. What we are seeing, of course, is in Europe and North America, pressure on politicians and others to focus on or going back to fossil fuel investments. And I think here it's important to distinguish between what might be short-term measures, which I think is what is under debate in Europe as well. How does one shield citizens from the increase in prices? And how does one ensure gas supply next winter and lower the dependence on the supply from Russia? But I think there's an important distinction in this discussion, which is one thing is which measures can be taken to ensure that, while not necessarily supporting or incentivizing big capital investments in the types of projects that lock that capital for 3-4 decades to come. So I think that is a big, I think it's a big point from a climate point of view, but I also think from an energy security point of view. So I think that is a big topic. And then of course, the topic of the middle and low income countries. We saw already the first months of the year, private capital outflows out of emerging markets. Quite significant capital outflows from emerging and from emerging markets and low income countries. And we also know that in these macroeconomic contexts, what we see often is private sector reverting to less risky, more conservative types of investment and moving away from emerging markets. So again, here, I think the conversation that is important to happen within Europe, with North America, within the broader climate community is, what is it that the public and private sector need to do together to really promote investments that are aligned with climate goals, and not just in developed countries, but also in middle income countries and low income countries. I think it's important to note that, and hopefully, you know, more and more of we have some private sector representatives here, and I'm sure that what I'm going to say, it's well understood. Most of the sustainable infrastructure investment opportunities that exist and that will exist in the years to come will be in emerging markets. That's where we have 75% of global population. That's where we have 5 billion people. That's where we are going to have most of the population growth. And that's where the gap in terms of infrastructure exists. And we know that if we don't do something, and those capital investments, again, are made in infrastructure investments that are not aligned with climate, we are locking in capital for several decades. So again, you know, the importance of coming together, developed countries, and on the public sector side and the private sector side, and really discussing and agreeing what will it take to mobilize the domestic capital, but in the international capital into emerging markets and low-income countries. I think that is a really important and big conversation. So I think those are basically some of the key points that I wanted to make, just to come back to the climate investment funds a little bit and give a little bit more context here. We were established by G8 in 2008 on the back of the financial crisis of 2008. And again, where, you know, we hadn't yet seen many climate investments in emerging markets or low-income countries. And many of the G8 countries came together and placed this amount of capital, which can take higher risk than commercial capital, that can be more patient than commercial capital, and can be more concessional at more attractive terms than commercial capital. And they pooled these resources together and asked of the multilateral development banks to work with the governments and with the private sector to really push forward investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, agriculture, forestry. And what we saw with this initiative is that this type of capital at a certain scale and deployed through institutions that are actually knowledgeable about those markets, about the emerging markets in the low-income countries. And they provided the necessary incentives to the governments to shift their investment decisions. But very importantly, they provided the necessary incentives for the private investors and that international capital to go into these countries and into those types of investment. And to me, what is important, you know, and I like to say is that was a time when, you know, in most of these markets, there hadn't yet been renewable energy investments. There was basically none in a lot of these markets. But the private investors were willing to go alongside the multilateral development banks and invest in wind and solar projects in a lot of these countries. So that gives me a little bit of hope and comfort, because with where we were in terms of renewable energy and where the markets were at that point in time, and we managed to really create markets where they didn't exist, that again, with the right level of public and private sector partnerships, that we can achieve what I was alluding to earlier on, which is bring these private investments into emerging markets. So let me stop here, and thank you again very much for the invitation. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mafalda, for your very valuable speech. And this is an inspiring kickoff for today's discussion. Of course, we appreciate the fact that you shared your reflections on the perspectives and the challenges that climate finance need to address during these difficult times. I think we should open the panel now to our 4 discussants that will provide us also an Italian angle on the role of finance for climate action. I said also, and it could be interesting to have. Let me start in alphabetical order by Antonella Baldino, as I said, Chief International Development Finance Officer at Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, board member of Market Fund, Credito Sportivo, and Fintechna. Antonella Baldino has been a director of the board of Terna and board member, vice presidents of Ansaldo Energia before joining Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. Baldino worked for key international financial institutions in corporate, investment banking, and research sector, focusing on infrastructure as well as public and development finance. Antonella Baldino, the floor is yours.
So thank you. First of all, good morning. Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm honored, I mean, to have the opportunity to participate in today's discussion and to represent the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in its role of the Italian financial institution for development cooperation. So thank you, Mrs. Duarte, for your speech, really inspiring and also very enlightening. And of course, I would like to thank Istituto Affari Internazionali for having organized this event, which comes at a very appropriate moment in the wake of the uncertain international situation. With the world, as you said, still recovering from the pandemic crisis, the current geopolitical situation is posing risk to the very ambitious global objective of the current decade that we also know as known as the decade of action. I'm of course referring to the 2030 agenda, to the Paris Agreement targets. And let me go straight to the point. We all recognize that contrasting climate change requires a global collaboration on a global scale, and emerging economies and developing countries are the more exposed, to the effect of the climate change, urgently need a transfer of technologies and financial resources in order to grow their economies and their societies in a just, green, and resilient way. So Italy is ready to play its part in the challenge of scaling up the global climate finance. At the G20 summit held in Rome last October, Italy announced a renewed pledge to mobilize $1.4 billion per year over the next 5 years in the field of climate finance. And to support this commitment, last December, our budget law established an Italian climate fund, which represent Italy is the main public instrument for climate finance. I would say also, taking your suggestion, a vehicle for a public-private partnership in this area. So the fund will support a wide range of projects, both public and private, in the climate and environmental protection areas in emerging economies and developing countries, with an endowment of 840 million euro per year over the next 5 years. So it's 4.2 billion euro, which will be deployed across a wide range of financial instruments, so loan, equity, and guarantee. Part of this endowment will also be used to provide technical assistance and capacity building facilities. So CDP is, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, in short, CDP is the sole appointed manager of the fund, and hence we will actively seek a dialogue with primary actors on the climate finance arena, both public and private, at national, regional, and supranational players. So starting, of course, with multilateral development banks and funds, which are, I would say, natural strategic partner for the Italian Climate Fund, but also for CDP itself. Actually, in CDP, the climate finance is already a priority focus. We have over 50% of our international development cooperation portfolio, which is dedicated to climate and environmental projects. And notably over the last few years, We have invested in a flagship green bond fund, global funds, which aim of promoting the growth of the green bond market in emerging and developing countries. We have invested in renewable energy projects, both on a direct basis, on a project basis, but also through dedicated private equity funds. We have promoted also the development of green infrastructures, mainly through financial partnerships with multilateral development banks. And of course, we are increasingly focused on new opportunities in the same areas. So let me say that in this context, we can observe strong alignment and strong opportunities for synergies between CDP efforts, the new Italian climate fund, and the priorities of the climate investment funds and its partners. First and foremost, the multilateral development banks. At CDP, so we are ready to play our part, and we look forward to establishing a concrete partnership with the climate investment funds. But before, let me say that before handing over to my colleagues in the panel, I just would like to go back quickly on the global uncertainty that you mentioned also, and that characterize our times. This uncertainty, we know, may also intensify the trends of an overall slowdown of globalization. And as you said, in a less interconnected, less connected, less collaborative also world, the most vulnerable countries may be the most heavily impacted, as their ability to catalyze and to attract sustainable and climate related investment would be impaired. So I think that we would really appreciate if your perspective and your opinion on which region of the world you feel will be most affected, and how also the Climate Investment Fund is planning to shape its effort in these most vulnerable areas. So, grazie molte, which is the word that you know, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antonella Baldino, for this comprehensive, in few minutes, overview of the achievements, activities, and initiatives that is GDP supporting in the field of sustainable and climate finance. The initiative of huge initiative of the Italian Climate Fund. We already knew how important is climate change and ecosystem protection as key areas in your activity, and now we know more, and we are happy that you share with us your initiatives. I now turn to Gisella Berardi, Deputy Director for Global Public Goods Office at the International Financial Relations Directorate, Treasury Department of Treasury of the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. She's a board member of Green Climate Fund, a council member of the Global Environment Facility, and of the Climate Investment Funds. She's responsible for the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, and also collaborated with the G20 agenda of the Italian presidency in 2021, and also involved in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change discussion at last COP. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Botti. As the other speakers, it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here today on behalf of the Minister of Economy and Finance. And we are very grateful for the Istituto Affari Internazionali for having invited us to this event. The speakers just before me very eloquently said how is challenging the situation that we are facing now. And so it's hard for me to add something new to this, to the concept, to the comments that they raised. Addressing climate change and just transition needs urgent action. And this is even more urgent in the energy crisis and the economic uncertainty that we are facing now due to the war and the conflict in Ukraine. This climate and energy transition entails also, as Mafalda and Ms. Baldino said, entails cost and huge investments, which are particularly needed in countries with reduced fiscal space and low access to financial markets. In particular, developing economies and emerging markets have the urgent need to collect necessary resources, both private and public, to finance innovation, green investment, as well as to protect the most vulnerable people and economic sector. The net zero transition can only be achieved if the global financial system and economies are on board. And this is a concept that Mafalda and Ms. Baldino already said. We need to build on efficient green financial markets to support developing countries in tackling climate change and nature-related issues. So the priorities is for sure reshaping the climate finance architecture. And to face this challenge in 2021, the G20 Italian presidency promoted an ambitious green agenda within the finance track discussion. And let me say that this was the first time in the history that the climate issues were discussed in the finance track. So for the green agenda was quite ambitious for an orderly global climate transition, including specific instruments to support the mitigation and adaptation efforts in emerging markets and developing countries. Three were the main deliverable of the finance track of the G20 presidency. The first one is the establishment of the Sustainable Finance Working Group and the approval of the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap. The roadmap analyzes existing gaps, challenges that hinder the potential of sustainable finance, and recommends a concrete, planned, and priority action to address these obstacles, especially in emerging countries. The second result, our presidency has promoted a regular discussion on the mix of policies needed to promote the transition to low carbon economies. This policy mix should include investment in sustainable infrastructure, innovative technologies, and political levers such as the price of carbon that we think we can agree all that is a key tool for supporting clean energy transition also in the emerging countries. The third result was the mandate to systematically analyze macroeconomic risk stemming from climate change and net benefits of different transition, with a focus on macroeconomic and distributional impact of risk prevention strategies and mitigation and adaptation policies. These results were not only important for the purpose of the G20 itself, but they contributed largely to the advancement of the negotiation of COP26 held in Glasgow, as well as to the construction of the agenda of other international fora like the G7 and other international climate initiatives. Let me add also that at COP26, Italy joined the statement on international public support for clean energy transition, which provides, among other things, to seize public support to the new fossil fuels project by the end of 2022. So all these, this brief overview to show which is the commitment of the Italian government in this regard. As for climate finance, on the occasion of the G20 leaders, Prime Minister announced the huge commitment that Ms. Baldino already mentioned, so I don't want to repeat. And of course, in this big commitment, the contribution and the allocation for the climate Italian Fund for Climate, managed by Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, is the big part. And I don't want to add anything more to what Ms. Baldini already illustrated very deeply in details. Consistent with our commitment to Paris Agreement, in December 2021, Italy joined very proudly, let me say, the climate investment funds. So I'm happy to be here with Mafalda and give the evidence of this commitment. And Italy approved an allocation of 150 million euro to this. And the resources have been allocated to the Nature, People and Climate Investments Program, whose objectives reflect the priority of the Italian G20 presidency. I mean, the 3 Ps, people, planet and prosperity, something already very well known. The program, the CIP program, seeks to address in an integrated way the multiple driving factors and the effect of human activities and climate change on local resources and ecosystem services, promoting strategic partnership with all stakeholders from national governments, private sector, civil societies. And CIP is very good in this. So we really have a very great expectation. Beyond this, the program that the Ministry of Finance decided to contribute to is expected also to guarantee subsidized and flexible loans to increase support for investment in nature-based solutions, with the aim to develop a public and private sector intervention. So this is another important point for the Ministry of Finance that pushed us to finance this program. And finally, as a climate finance, I think that could deserve some interest to mention the fact that as part of the new Resilience and Sustainability Trust instrument established in the IMF, a portion of the new allocation of 650 billion in special drawing rights will be destined for the most vulnerable countries to support the long-term interventions, including actions to combat climate change. So in this perspective, it's I couldn't agree more with my previous colleagues that both public and private actors will have to do their part, and together with the international financial institution, including the MDBs. So because the MDBs scaling up efforts for global sustainable recovery through their financial and technical support are also critical to leverage private finance, while supporting the creation of credible pipeline of investable project and also developing innovative financing options and address barriers to accessing capital markets. So through global cooperation, we can turn really great challenges into opportunity and to build back better and greener towards a more sustainable and resilient net zero future. And I'll stop here. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Gisella Berardi. We, as the Istituto Affari Internazionali, had the opportunity and honor to appreciate during the Italian presidency of the G20 the crucial role of the Ministry of Economy and Finance in reinforcing the Italian long-term commitment to sustainability and climate change. Let me just highlight something. Let me do the moderator and highlight something that I see in these two first intervention, the potential for cooperation with the CIF. This is really interesting to underline. Thank you very much for your intervention. So now I can introduce Federica Calvetti. I hope you can hear us.
Yes, yes, very well. Hello, can you hear me?
Thanks for being connected and for being here, for accepting our invitation. Federica Calvetti is Chief of ESG and Strategic Activism at Eurizon, where she also coordinates activity in the field of corporate governance and sustainability after a career in sustainable finance in Deutsche Bank and among others. She previously participated in working groups in International Capital Market Association and UK Oil and Gas Authority Task Force. Thank you very much, Federica. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to Mrs. Duarte for your time, for the opportunity to be here and hear your thoughts. And thank you very much, of course, to the Istituto Affari Internazionali for creating such a great opportunity to exchange views between the institutional, private and public sector. So just a word, perhaps, Eurizon is the largest institutional investor in Italy. We manage 438 billion of assets as of the end of last year. We are 100% owned by Intesa Sanpaolo, and I know several of my colleagues are on the line. And Intesa is the largest Italian banks with a global footprint. So for us, it's really a great opportunity to be here and be able to discuss this topic. It was with pleasure that I heard you talking about impact and talking about the challenges of climate change and how very much those challenges are interlinked with social dynamics, which we cannot forget, of course. So mentioning the just transition and mentioning sustainability in a more holistic and rounded way. Starting with climate change, as a group, I can tell you that our commitment is second to none. The bank itself is a member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and we at Eurizon were the first asset manager in Italy to undersign the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is an initiative that obviously, as you know, looks at achieving net zero emissions by 2050. But as part of this commitment, I believe one distinctive goal is to try and improve and increase investments in climate solutions. So namely, all those investments that have to do with renewable energy that you mentioned, energy efficiency, and those investments that I would say bring concrete and impactful and measurable content on the table. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind, because when we think about net zero and we think about 2050, this is always long dated. But in reality, our challenge, it's really to create something that is impactful today and will be impactful in the short term. So, you know, the role of asset managers in general, when we talk about climate finance, it's something that it's been, highlighted also by the EU Sustainable Action Plan in 2018 already, where we're really seen as the link that can really drive capital towards those geographies and towards those businesses where sustainable investments can make a difference. And I think we're doing this at a time where there are challenges that are coming from clearly the geopolitical crisis, what you mentioned in terms of the energy mix and how fast this energy mix needs to change, and also how we will deal with energy security as obviously as a continent in Europe when we try to play into the global field. But we always have to remember that all those challenges that are long term will need to create an impact. So for us also the notion of trying to contribute to the development goals, to the UN SDGs, for us it's extremely important. So you mentioned no poverty, you mentioned diversity, you mentioned the just transition, and you mentioned how important it is to keep into account these aspects for low and middle income countries as well. But I have to say that something that is very important for us and I think it will be a challenge, and I am keen to obviously then open up the discussion when the time is appropriate today, is how to monitor and how we do set up the governance of these projects, right? Especially in regions where you said, Mrs. Duarte, we have the ability to channel investments to give confidence, but at the same time, we need confidence back from investing in certain countries where perhaps commitments are not there, where perhaps transparency and the ability to control governance on the projects is not always there. So for us, I think it will be great to understand a little bit more what our role could be, both as a bank, as an asset manager, how these projects are sourced, are originated, how they're screened, how they're monitored, to really try to make it as concrete as possible, bearing in mind that, yes, we have a very long-term objectives, which I think, despite the geopolitical crisis, I've heard you say, and I agree completely, the long-term objective is still there. But in the short and medium term, I think we need to escalate and accelerate our commitments, and we need to make them concrete. So for me, it would be great to then, when the time is appropriate, like I said, hear more thoughts about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Federica Calvetti, not only for the complete summary of your commitment, or Orizzon's commitment to sustainable investment, the implementation of sustainability principle in your activity, but also for the questions and the insights that we'll discuss at the end of all the discussant intervention. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will now turn to Maurizio Maugeri, Head of International Business Development for Eni Green Traditional Refining and Marketing. Maurizio Maugeri developed his 27 years career in Eni as senior executive working across domestic and international activities, such as logistic, wholesale, lubricants, and others. Maurizio, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me well. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the time that we can dedicate to this issue. I prepared a short message to you, but I prefer to start from what Federica Calvetti has raised as a point, because I think that links very well to what was the message that Eni and myself would like to deliver to this table. Correctly, Federica said how we can monitor the investment that we do for this type of initiative. It's clear that we are in a period of great uncertainty and crisis, but energy transition will not stop. It's for sure that the war between Russia and Ukraine has raised once again the security energy problem that probably many of us has forgotten. But this is a problem that is on the table that we cannot forget. But taking away this aspect, coming back to the energy transition, we can say that energy transition will not stop. Will not stop and will move forward, and will need important huge capital. But in our view, the only way to mobilize this huge capital, and the only way to get also the system able to raise these funds, and also to have some returns, at the same time to monitor, is to have a direct involvement of the people that is around this investment. What does it mean? Now I will try to explain the model the Eni is trying to develop. Eni is investing more or less 7 billion euros per year in the next 4 years. Today, 30% are devoted to green project, and this percentage will increase substantially, because Eni is a net zero target 2050, but also in 2030 we will be minus 35 and minus 80% in 2040. So it's an accelerated process. Eni is not doing just a work to reduce scope 1 and scope 2, but we are going towards scope 3. That means what the clients at the end of the story are consuming. This means producing products that probably you know now from the newspapers, so biojet like SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, or hydrogenated vegetable oils, HVO, or hydrogen, or bioethanol second generation. But I mean, these are something that are based mainly as part hydrogen to biofuels. That is something that where you have available technologies and you have available infrastructure. The other things, I'm sorry if I am a little bit provocative, but are something that needs 10 years, 15 years, maybe more to be developed. So the solution that we have now is biofuel. Biofuel has a constraint. The constraint is feedstock availability. So what is doing ENI? ENI is working hard to untap this feedstock availability. How? Working on countries like Africa, for example, where ENI is a strong presence, and where you have arid and semi-arid land that can be valorized. So what we are doing is building a low ILUC system of production. So without going in competition with food, but trying to bring all these farmers of these potential land that are abandoned and bringing some income for this farmer that can, of course, grow their family, be totally involved in this project because they feel this project theirs. I can tell you that it's not the same with renewable, with the production of energy. It's not the same. Why? When they look at land, you have the villages that are involved. And in that way, you can build a production feedstock like castor oil or like rotation crops that can eventually go and alimент this vertical integrated chain until the products that are decarbonized. So the solution that ENI is applying is having the decarbonized product, but coming through a chain where the local population see a contribution in terms of GDP. In this work, we are involving also some financial institutions like European Bank, like African Development Bank, like cooperation agencies. And we are seeing that there is a great interest to mobilize this investment because they see that there is a project, there is an industrial partner that can look all the chain and that is available, I mean, to mobilize this investment for what? To bring products, of course, in Western countries, as well as products also in developing countries, but especially we are bringing welfare and wellness to this population. So this is the message that I would like to share with you. The message is, if people in these countries are involved with it, they feel no they control. I mean, you can say, but also in hydrocarbon they feel no, because not the same. The hydrocarbon is managed more from the elite of a country. But in this case, when you have to go to the villages, when you have to go with the farmers, when you go to the families, there they feel exactly that they are part of the transition and they will support it because they see something concrete for them. Thank you.
Maurizio Maggiari, thank you very much for sharing your reflection on the issue through the lens of the ENI activities on the ground. So it was really interesting. We already know how you, as ENI, includes principle of environmental and social responsibility in your business, and it was very interesting to hear your insights for potential discussion now that we collect all your contribution. I think that I have to turn to Mafalda Duarte again. We just have 5 minutes, but I'm sure we can stay a little bit longer if you allow. There were many questions, and inside I don't know where you're going to start, but I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I think that this was great, and I hope that this is the first of several conversations with CDP and with others, Federica and Maurizio. Yes, and great to hear about the climate fund. I'm sure that we can find opportunities to partner in some of the some of the investments. You said, Antonella, you reflected on the global uncertainty and the fact that we might be seeing a slowdown of globalization. I mean, this would require a lot of untangling, and I'm sure that the IAI, Istituto Affari Internazionali, reflects on this as well, because I think there are political dimensions, there are economic dimensions. Some of the economic dimensions might actually be beneficial from a climate point of view, such as localizing more of the production from a carbon footprint point of view. So one has to untangle the different dimensions of globalization. But I do think that I come back to a point that I made earlier, which is most of the opportunities of investment will happen in middle and low income countries. And therefore, from that point of view, I'm quite confident that there will be domestic private, an intensification of use of domestic flows, financial flows for those investments, but also of international capital flows, because they will also be needed. The question comes back to this point of what is it that the public and the private sector need to do, and what are the sort of partnerships to accelerate the pace of those investments. I think that that's going to be quite critical. We ourselves right now, we have defined what would be our strategy for the next few years. And remember, we work with the multilateral development banks as a system. And by working with them and given their presence in these markets, and they're present not just from an investment point of view, but from a policy point of view as well, because they are strictly connected to the governments and to the public policy dimensions. Our hope is, and they bring others. That is the power of the multilateral development banks. And Gisela knows there's a lot of discussions on how can they do more? What is it that needs to happen within this system of multilateral development banks so that they can do more, play a bigger role. But they bring others alongside because they give this comfort. They bring private sector, they bring other bilateral agencies. They probably have many co-investments. CDP has several co-investments with them. So that role that they play of bringing other types of capital is quite important. We will be focusing on 4 main areas, which we see as them as a system, multilateral development banks, having to play a big role in unlocking markets. One is the energy transition, the continuation of the energy transition agenda, but quite a bit emphasizing the accelerating coal transition, and also the investments in infrastructure that are necessary and in the power system so that they can take on this much larger scale of renewable energy intermittent capacity. So this is an area where we are going to be focusing quite a bit. The other area is industrial decarbonization, where the multilateral development banks haven't really been engaging much. And it is important in our view and our governance that they play a bigger role in climate smart cities. So really driving new green urban development models and nature, what Gisela was talking about. Planet, people, is it planet, people, prosperity? but all of the dimensions of natural capital. So this is where we are going to be focusing our efforts in the coming years. We have been doing quite a lot of work on just transition. And I'm really glad that everybody mentioned it here today, because the way we look at it is, unless if we bring just transition to the core of climate investments and climate action, we are not going to succeed in terms of meeting those goals. It's very clear, because people will oppose the reforms. And we've seen this happening in Chile, we've seen happening in France, we've seen happening in Ecuador in the recent years. People will oppose. If they don't see that the governments are really placing their needs and making sure that the right policies and investments are happening so that they are not left behind. So we have been doing quite a lot of work in this area, trying to bring back to the international community the fact that this is not just an energy sector issue. It is an issue that cuts across all sectors. And as a matter of fact, that the analysis that are required to really drive that agenda are missing in many countries. They have just not been done. Many countries really need to enhance their systems for participatory engagement of the communities. First of all, mapping of all of the relevant stakeholders, but mechanisms for engaging all of the relevant stakeholders. And also the analysis, the distributional impact analysis, for example, that are necessary. An understanding of who stands to lose, who stands to benefit the most from these transitions. And what is it that it will take to make sure that those who stand to lose the most, we think about the necessary education programs, social protection programs, diversification of livelihood programs that will help them. So everything, and we are coming up with tools to make it concrete from an operational point of view. What would this look like from an operational point of view? Which we believe will help not just the multilateral development banks, but other partners as well out there. So this is our commitment and areas of focus. We are also very committed in providing a contribution in terms of further private sector capital mobilization, looking at ways through which we can really enable institutional capital by using our public capital as credit enhancer of institutional capital flows. So that is one area that we are also paying quite a lot of attention to. Federica, you asked, I'm trying to try to be mindful of time, monitoring of results and issues around governance and transparency. So that is one of the advantages that I see of private sector capital partnering with multilateral development banks. If they don't have sufficient exposure to these markets and they don't feel sufficiently comfortable with the markets, the partnering of the multilateral development banks is a good way to be engaged and get exposure because the multilateral development banks have that, they have the systems in place. They have very specific systems on how they monitor, what is their due diligence, how do they monitor? They visit these projects really frequently. They have people on the ground, they have people in their headquarters, they have constant dialogue with the governments. And so they bring that level of robustness in terms of due diligence, not just in the design of the projects, but in the implementation of the projects. What we try to do on our side in working with them is help them enhance their processes, in terms of thinking about measuring impact. I think they have robust systems in terms of monitoring progress and results on the ground. One of the areas that we have been working with them is enhancing the methodologies through which we measure impact, or help them, for example, in some of the things that we were talking about. What does it mean to think about just transition operationally? How does that manifest? What are the sort of analysis that need to be done when we are designing projects, or even upfront of designing projects? And what are the measures then to monitor the impact? Because when it comes to just transition, as I said, there are two key dimensions. To simplify a little bit, is what we call procedural justice. Is, are people being involved and are people being engaged in the decisions, but not just in terms of what are the investments that will be prioritized, but then also in implementation. What are the processes that are being put in place to make sure that they themselves are engaged during implementation, and they own what's happening, and they help do course corrections when things are not necessarily happening the way they need to happen. So there are those two dimensions. There's the dimension of procedural justice. There's the dimension of the distributional justice. We need to have upfront analysis of who stands to lose and benefit. And then, but we also need to continue that work when you are implementing projects, because sometimes, you know, and we know about projects, this is like that, things don't necessarily go the way they are supposed to go. Political economy has changed. There's been changes that have happened. So we have to keep monitoring so that we can also make course corrections while the investments are ongoing. So this is what we try to do with them. But again, you know, coming back to the other point of the monitoring of the results and the transparency and the stability, our investments are anchored in this MDB system, and they have pretty robust. Doesn't mean that they can't be enhanced, and this is what I was saying that we try to do, but they have pretty robust systems in place. What else do I see here? So, I mean, in a sense, what I said speaks to what Mauricio was talking about as well, the importance of the direct involvement of the people, where these investments are happening. We fully agree. But I mean, for us, because we are involved quite from the upstream to the downstream, we want to make sure that there are analyses happening that are not just localized where specific investments are going to happen, but there's broader analysis that are needed at the regional and at the national levels, because the issues of just transition have national and regional dimensions. We work quite a bit on South Africa, and you might have seen that at COP26 there was a partnership announced to drive energy transition, just energy transition in South Africa. We are actively involved in that. And I mean, South Africa is a good example of what we are talking about in terms of just transition. The areas that stand to be affected by coal transition are in one part of the country. The best areas to invest in renewable energy are in other parts of the country. And we know how difficult it is to move people from one region to the other region where the opportunities might lie. And it's not necessarily straightforward that the skill set that they have for the coal industry is the same skill set that is needed for the renewable energy sector. So this is why it's important to do this work at the national level and look at these dimensions and challenges of where are really the opportunities for investment and where are the communities that stand to lose the most from these transitions, and what is it that it's needed from a national level, policies at the national level, at the local level, what is it that is needed? Because otherwise, if we don't do that and we just do what has been happening so far, which is we support the renewable energy investments and they happen in a part of the country, but the other part of the country is seeing that they are the ones standing to lose, and they don't see necessarily the investments that will respond to their concerns, they will oppose the transition. And we can't blame people for that, because these are their livelihoods. These are many people that would just lose their jobs and not have alternative livelihoods to live on. So this is a little bit some of the reflections, but again, as I said, I think hopefully this is a first of more discussions and exchanges that we might have, and I very much look forward to the possibility of having some partnerships, as Antonella mentioned, exploring some partnerships with the institutions here in Italy. Thank you very much again to Instituto Affari Internazionale. Thank you for hosting this.
Oh, thank you very much to you. We significantly ran out of time, but we're not going to have a real Q&A session. We collected several questions, but most of them have been replied by your this final intervention. Just I would like to give some value to all this participation from the platforms, and just pose a little question, final question from the box. Infrastructure needed in emerging countries, what the CIF is doing now with the private sector. You gave us some insights on that. The question comes from Roberto Ranieri, IMI, Intesa Sanpaolo.
Yes, and happy to also have some bilateral, or have my team have some bilateral discussion, but we finance not just governments, but we finance private sector directly. So we finance private sector in investors that have invested in renewable energy, but not just in renewable energy, that have invested in forestry, for example. They are making investments in agriculture. So we have our portfolio is 25% of our resources go directly to private sector investors. And some of the information is online, is in our website, but we're happy to provide information to those interested as well. So we have a very interesting portfolio of private sector investments.
Thank you very much. I know with the speakers in presence, so they have the opportunity to have more interaction with you if they want. So Mafalda Duarte, let me just express the appreciation of the Institute for your visit to our office and contribution to this debate with key Italian stakeholders. And thank you very much to all the speakers for their intervention and all this interaction that followed. Also thanks to the participants that are in the audience for an active interaction. Unfortunately, we couldn't include all the in the discussion all the insights and questions, but I think we are approaching the end. If there are no other questions or comments, I think we can have lunch, and hope you have a good day. Thank you very much.